Hi, this is Scott Mingus. I'm talking tonight about a book that Joe O and I wrote through Savas about the Texas soldiers at the Battle of Chickamauga. You might ask, why Texans at Chickamauga? One thing that was pretty evident as we were looking through the background material and sources that eventually became this book is you could actually tell the entire story of the Battle of Chickamauga, at least most of the entire story, through the eyes of the Texas soldiers who fought there. There were Texans in almost every major segment of the Battle of Chickamauga. And through their personal stories that they told in the days, months, and years following the Civil War, you can pretty much get a picture for what it must have been like for the average Confederate soldier at that battle. And indeed, you can translate that, I'm sure, to the thoughts and emotions of the Union soldiers who were going through the same battle. Let's step back and look a little bit at the history of how the Battle of Chickamauga came about. In December 31st, 1862, January 1st, 1863, the Confederate Army of Braxton Bragg and the Union Army of William Rosecrans fought each other to a bloody pulp in northern Tennessee at the Battle of Murfreesboro, as the Confederates called it, or Stones River, as the Union called this battle. Now, both armies were pretty much sitting idle the rest of the winter. Bragg retreated into the highlands of central Tennessee. Rosecrans pursued him for a while, and everybody kind of hunkered down to await the resumption of better weather in the spring. When that finally came, Rosecrans was under tremendous pressure from the U.S. War Department and the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, to get aggressive and start moving against Bragg. Now, Bragg, by contrast, was also under pressure from Jefferson Davis, who was certainly not happy that the Confederates at this stage were still in a position where central Tennessee was being threatened. The Union forces attacked at several different mountain passes that Bragg had fortified with Confederate troops. Perhaps the best known of these small actions is the Battle of Hoover's Gap, where Union forces under John T. Wilder repulsed a number of Confederate attacks and then actually pushed their way through the Confederates and eventually seized the gap. Now, Wilder's men were equipped with multiple shot repeating rifles. People teased later that they could load on Sunday and fire all week long. But Wilder's men, with a tremendous firepower, was able to push back the Confederates. And Bragg eventually started withdrawing most of his forces in and around Tullahoma, Tennessee, and then from there continued to march southward as he was getting additional forces that were beginning to come into his ranks to reinforce the fairly battered Army of Tennessee. As these folks were continuing to push their way southward throughout June and July of 1863, much of the newspaper coverage in the United States and the Confederate States of America focused on a small village in south central Pennsylvania called Gettysburg and Vicksburg, Mississippi, the two twin battles that were garnering the vast majority of the newspaper headlines. While this is going on, though, here in central Tennessee, Bragg's army and Rosecrans' army were engaging this cat and mouse game that were heading for the Tennessee River and Chattanooga. Chattanooga, in a lot of ways, was considered to be the gateway to the South. Much of the transportation links that went through there ended up in Alabama or in Georgia or in points west, in fact. Four key railroads, the Memphis and Charleston, the Western and Atlantic that ran into Georgia, the Nashville and Chattanooga that ran, of course, on out to Nashville, and the East Tennessee Railroad, all coalesced, if you will, or intersected in some cases in Chattanooga. There was also, of course, river transportation, making Chattanooga a very significant base, particularly for Confederate operations in central Tennessee. A vast commissary supplies, stores of various kinds, ammunition, spare equipment, all were being based in Chattanooga. The town also hosted a number of significant Confederate field hospitals, permanent hospitals, where again, thousands of wounded Confederate or ill Confederate soldiers were being treated. Bragg's job, in effect, according to the Confederate War Department, was to hang on to Chattanooga. They did not want this town to fall, but Bragg, in July of 1863, walked away and marched out of Chattanooga and gave it back to the Union Army, gave it to the Union Army. Now, as he was marching towards North Georgia, he had a number of Texans in his rank, hence our book that we're talking about tonight. Let's briefly describe some of these Texas units. James Dessler commanded a brigade of predominantly Texans and Arkansans. He's an Alabama native. He's a West Point graduate, had fought in several U.S. military expeditions, most notably to California and the Utah War against the Mormons. In 1861, he joined the Confederate cause as an artillery commander, and within a year was a colonel. He was later promoted to brigadier general and took command of the consolidated regiment of men that, along with Dessler and the brigade's previous commander, had surrendered to William T. Sherman at Fort Heiman at Arkansas Post, Arkansas, back in early 1863. Now, much like Willard's brigade at Gettysburg had to endure and then overcome the sobriquet of Harper's Ferry cowards for having surrendered at Harper's Ferry in 1862, similarly, Dessler's men had to overcome hoots and jeers and catcalls from the veterans of the Army of Tennessee that these men had surrendered at Arkansas Post. They were parolees, and so they became known as the Arkansas Post parolees. Each of these regiments was very small. They were consolidated, 3 regiments in total that had been consolidated from 11 different regiments. And so Dessler's got a chip on his shoulder. In fact, William T. Sherman had tried to make small talk with Dessler as a prisoner after he was being captured at Arkansas Post, telling him that he was acquainted with a number of Desslers from Central Ohio, where Sherman had grown up. And James Dessler didn't want anything to do with William Sherman, basically walked away. The second brigade we're going to be focusing on tonight is Matthew Ector's brigade. Matt Ector is a Georgia native. He's unlike Dessler. He doesn't have much military experience. He's a lawyer turned politician turned political officer. He is a brigadier general, having served as a cavalry commander of the 14th Texas Cavalry. He has a mixed force of infantry and dismounted cavalry. I should mention, by the way, at this point in the Civil War, many of Texas's cavalry regiments were now dismounted. They either were never given horses when they started, or they had to turn the horses in. And so they were fighting as infantry at this point in time. So you can again see Ector's brigade. Matt Ector is considered to be a pretty good officer despite the lack of training. The other permanent troops that had been at Stones River earlier in the year, who were from Texas in the Army of Tennessee, was Colonel Tom Harrison's brigade. They were part of Fighting Joe Wheeler's brigade of division of cavalry. The 8th Texas Cavalry, commonly known as Terry's Texas Rangers, and the 11th Texas Cavalry will play a role in the upcoming Chickamauga fighting. The final troops, and these are among the reinforcements that have been rushed to reinforce Bragg's army, was John Gregg's brigade. They were sent up from Mississippi, from the Army of Mississippi. They had been kept in camp at Enterprise, Mississippi, following the Battle of Raymond. Had fought pretty well there, lost a number of men. They only have one Texas regiment, but that's under a very talented man, Colonel Hiram Granberry, who will later, a year later, be one of the 6 Confederate generals to be killed at the Battle of Franklin in 1864. But now he's a colonel, and he's commanding the 7th Texas underneath John Gregg. John Gregg is very tall, kind of a John Wayne type figure, very tall, very commanding presence, if you will, extremely popular with his men, although he does have somewhat of a reputation as a martinet. But his men like him, and they fight really hard for him. These are the Texans that are at the Army of Tennessee as the army is retreating into the mountains of North Georgia after marching out of Chattanooga. Now, they're going to march into McLemore's Cove and go further south under the Pigeon Hills. This is Lookout Mountain in the picture. Many of us are familiar with that name, of course, from the subsequent Battle of Chattanooga later in November of 63, sorry. But this is the southwestern side of Lookout Mountain, looking north towards Tennessee. This, of course, is in Georgia. Now, McLemore's Cove is going to be a battleground as the Battle of Chattanooga, as a maneuvering that leads to Chattanooga begins. There will be a small battle called Davis's Crossroads. Patrick Cleburne, the famed Irishman who commands a division in Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee, he is going to decide to engage Union forces that are moving south as Rosecrans starts pushing his entire army south from Chattanooga, with the exception of Crittenden's corps. He's going to move most of George Thomas's men, that Thomas being a Virginian who would stay loyal to the Union. Thomas's men are going to move into McLemore's Cove, particularly James Negley's division. Claiborne takes the opportunity under orders from Bragg to initiate combat, comes down off Pigeon Mountain, marches to the northwest, and smacks into Negley in this fighting that goes on in McLemore's Cove. It's a relatively non-consequential battle. A few guys are shot and killed, unfortunately for them. But there's nothing really accomplished on either side with this fighting. It does, however, signal to both Bragg and Rosecrans that the opponents are near, and they have a general feeling for where each other are. As you can see from the map on the right of the screen, Bragg's army occupies a wide swath of northwestern Georgia, with Wheeler's cavalry on the south, Forrest's cavalry on the north, and various troops in between. With this tactical situation in mid-September 1863, the Confederate Army starts sending more troops to reinforce Bragg. Specifically, they're going to send James Longstreet's First Corps, the Army in Northern Virginia. These are the very same troops that have fought at Gettysburg back in July of 1863. They are going to be hot rushed to North Georgia. The problem is there's not enough rail transportation to send an entire corps from Richmond to Atlanta and on to North Georgia. And the other complicating factor is what railroads that are available don't have the same gauge. So it's not terribly uncommon for Longstreet's men to arrive in one town on Railroad A, have to march several miles, sometimes less, to another railroad head that has a different gauge, reload all their ammunition, supply wagons, equipment, etc., and then go down to the next train only to repeat the process again. As such, Longstreet's corps gets strung out all the way from Virginia to Georgia. His artillery under Colonel E. Porter Alexander will not arrive at all in time for the Battle of Chickamauga, and about a third of Longstreet's men will never arrive at all. So while well-intentioned, the idea of moving troops out to the west just simply proves to be too much to get them in time for the fighting. Now, Hood's brigade and Hood's division, actually, with the Texas Brigade, formerly Hood's Texans under now Jerome Robertson, do filter in on September 17th and 18th, as does Kershaw's brigade, which is following them. Again, veterans of the Battle of Antietam and Gettysburg. So as Longstreet's vanguard starts arriving on September 18th, 1863, these are the opposing forces at Chickamauga. Rosecrans' Army of the Cumberland, about 60,000 men. They are outnumbered. One of the few battles of this period of the Civil War in which the Confederacy still has a majority on the battlefield. The Army of the Cumberland is split into 4 corps. Pap Thomas, Daniel McCook, Crittenden, and Gordon Granger in reserve, and then have a cavalry corps. Similarly, Bragg has organized his army almost identically, with the exception that he has 2 cavalry corps, one under Nathan Bedford Forrest, the other one under Fighting Joe Wheeler. Now, a lot of these new reinforcements, the guys that come up from the Army of Mississippi, the gentlemen that have arrived from Virginia, Hood's Texans, if you want to call them gentlemen, they are going to be put in a provisional operation known as Bushrod Johnson's Provisional Division. And then they're given to John Bell Hood to have overall command. So on September 18th, Bragg, his plan is to push to the northeast, slip around the supposedly vulnerable left flank of Rosecrans' army. Little did he know that Rosecrans is moving to the northeast as well. And so you've got 2 armies that are on parallel paths that are certainly going to collide. The key to the whole situation is West Chickamauga Creek, a meandering, fairly swift flowing, icy cold mountain stream that originated in the Pigeon Mountains, if you will, and was a significant landmark on the battle. Very steep banked, hard to cross, very few fords. This did have a number of significant bridges. 2 in particular we're going to talk about today. One is Alexander's Bridge, as you can see in the right center of the picture. That's defended by the seemingly ever-present John T. Wilder and his Lightning Brigade, and then Colonel Minty's Brigade of Union Cavalry, U.S. regulars, as well as cavalry from New York and Pennsylvania that are guarding Reed's Bridge. Those are the 2 bridges that the Confederates decide they need to take to start pushing west across West Chickamauga Creek. Texans are present at the fighting for Reed's Bridge. You can see the picture I took of West Chickamauga Creek standing on the modern Reed's Bridge. Underneath it is what the bridge would have looked like. That's a period sketch of the wooden bridge that existed there at the time. John Gregg with the 7th Texas will spearhead the attack of Bushrod Johnson's provisional division. And they are going to push back the Federals from the creek. They're going to eventually push away across Reed's Bridge. The Yankees had tried to destroy it, but they'd only thrown down the planks, and the Confederates were able to put the planks back and put other passageways in place so that they could get across this creek rather easily and engage and then drive off Minty. Similarly, the Confederates attacked Alexander's Bridge, but they were getting a lot more problems here, again, because of the firepower of the Lightning Brigade that were just simply holding off wave after wave of Confederates, particularly St. John Liddell's men from Walker's Reserve Corps. That night, as the Confederates start consolidating their strength on the west side of West Chickamauga Creek, there'll be one of the Civil War's rare night fights. Now, this isn't a very long or detailed fight. John Gregg's 7th Texas in particular is going to engage Wilder's Lightning Brigade in the woods. You see the position there on the screen of the 7th Texas. But again, it's pitch black. It's well after 10 p.m. When this fighting occurs. And again, the 2 sides will shoot at the muzzle flashes from the other side. But again, it just goes to show Bragg and Rosecrans the relative positions of each side. Now, some historians don't consider the fighting on the 18th to be much of the, or a formal part of the fighting at Chickamauga. Others do. So sometimes you'll see Chickamauga referred to as a 3-day battle, 18th, 19th, and 20th. Other times you'll see it referred to as a 2-day battle, with these preliminary fights being somewhat back-burnered, if you will. For the purposes of our book, my co-author Joe Owen and I have decided to treat all 3 of these as a singular battle of Chickamauga. The morning of the 19th, the festivities get underway in spades. Nathan Bedford Forrest, dismounted cavalry will start attacking Union forces. He'll be hit by additional Union troops, and Bragg will funnel Matthew Ector's brigade of Texans, Arkansans, and Missourians into the fray. There's going to be spirited fighting in the woods. This is very dense, much like the wilderness of the East. Chickamauga is a lot of second growth, sometimes primary growth, heavily underbrushed, just a miserable place to be maneuvering troops, let alone to start shooting at each other. And very soon a canopy of smoke, starts enveloping the battlefield and makes visibility incredibly difficult. Ector's brigade is smashed into the side by U.S. regulars in King's brigade. Croxton's brigade is going to hit them as well. A number of fighting's going to happen, and eventually Ector's men are going to pull back with force to the vicinity of Jay's Mill, and they're going to try it again. They're going to try a second attack and go slamming back in one more time. And again, Ector's men are repulsed. And for the most part, at least on September 19th, Ector's part in the enfolding drama of Chickamauga is over for the day. But farther to the southwest, the battle starts intensifying as again, Bragg and Thomas and Rosecrans are feeding more and more troops into the fray. And so the center of this battle is going to keep pushing south. And you can see in this map as Ector's launching his second attack on John King's U.S. regulars, you will see Starkweather's brigade, Scribner's brigade of Baird's division come roaring under the field. They're going to hit Wilson's men. And again, this fighting is just going to continue to keep escalating farther and farther to the southwest as the morning drags on and now into early afternoon. By that point in time, by 2 o'clock in the afternoon of September 19th, most of the Thomas's Corps are now on the scene, the 14th Corps. Most of the men from the 21st Corps are now on their way, soon to arrive, including Phil Sheridan, an infantry brigade commander at this point in time, as they're arriving on the scene. Bragg has got most of his army deployed. Again, you see Chatham, you see Bushrod Johnson, you see William Preston. John C. Breckinridge, the former Vice President of the United States, is coming on the scene. Daniel Harvey Hill, another veteran of the Army in Northern Virginia, is leading his troops. Claiborne's hot rushing from Pigeon Mountain to arrive. They won't get there till night, but they will be in a position to support these attacks. I've circled in yellow John Bell Hood. These are the guys, of course, the Army in Northern Virginia, and they are going to launch a vicious attack on Union lines on the Vineyard Farm. Now, again, there's a number of very familiar names on the Union side here, one of which is Don Carlos Buell. Buell, of course, had fought earlier at Shiloh. Eli Lilly, who's commanding a Indiana artillery battery, is the very same Eli Lilly that will launch the world famous pharmaceutical company that still exists, obviously, today. Hans Hegg, not terribly familiar to many Civil War people, but widely known at the time in Wisconsin. In fact, has a statue in Wisconsin in front of the State House. Hans Hegg will die at Chickamauga, but his men are going to take the brunt of the Hood's Texas Brigade's attack, particularly as the 4th and 5th Texas come ripping into Hegg's men. They will disperse them after some stubborn fighting, and Hegg's men from Wisconsin and Kansas will start retreating. At the same time, the left of Robertson's brigade, Hood's Texans, will split off, and they will basically operate as their own independent wing, the 1st Texas and the 3rd Arkansas, and they will continue drifting to the southwest. They will slam into the 26th Ohio, later into the 100th Illinois, of attacks from a wide variety of artillery batteries. Up on the hill, you see the 2nd Michigan, 3rd Wisconsin, 26th Pennsylvania, troops like that are firing into the field. And Hood's Texans, many boys that survived the attacks on Hawks Ridge and later on Little Round Top at Gettysburg will drop here at Chickamauga. It's an incredibly bloody fighting. And again, they failed to penetrate the position. They pushed the Yankees back multiple times, but the Union forces continually reinforced and continually reforming, keep coming back, thanks to the power of the artillery that is horribly outgunning the Confederate artillery in this part of the field. Well, that night, as the fighting is pretty much stopped for the day, Patrick Cleburne arrives. And when Patrick Cleburne arrives on the field, usually chaos ensues. Cleburne, ever aggressive, is going to launch an attack that night after dark with his entire division. So he's going to send all three of his brigades into action. He's also going to be augmented by other troops from other parts of the Army of Tennessee, and they're going to launch a vicious night attack as well. This time, this attack will succeed. They will start pushing back much of the Union forces that are fighting against, including Dodge. That's Granville Dodge. He's the guy that Dodge City of Matt Dillon fame and Gunsmoke fame is named for. You got the Russian Turchin that's arrived on the scene. You've got the German August Willich. I mean, you've got just a number of Union's commanders that are trying to stymie Deschler and Smith and Sam Wood. There's attack here in Lucius Polk, who's, I believe, a nephew of Leonidas Polk, who's commanding one of the corps in the Army of Tennessee. These attacks peter out because darkness. The fields are on fire. Much of the battlefield is actually illuminated by flaming trees that have been caught on fire from the shell bursts. Wounded men, much like Wilderness, the next year in 1864, are perishing in the flames. The battlefield is just a horrible, agonizing screams from all across the field long into the night. The Texans of Deschler's brigade, several of them will say this is one of the most haunting nights of the entire Civil War because of just the pathos, not being able to help the men that are burning to death in the woods. Well, morning comes, there's still a pall of smoke all across the Chickamauga battlefield, and the fighting soon resumes. Longstreet is now on the scene himself. He's arrived late in the evening and went to see Braxton Bragg, and Bragg has given him command of the center of the field. So Longstreet now, again, with some of his own troops, but with a lot of generals he doesn't know now under his command here in the center of the field. People like, again, Bushrod Johnson, Thomas Hindman, William Preston, Frank Cheatham, Alexander Stewart. These are veterans of the Army of Tennessee, but now they're going to report to Longstreet. Well, there'll be a whole series of attacks being initiated on the morning of the 20th. The one that has the most promise but fizzles out is John C. Breckinridge trying to turn the Union flank with states' right gist. Benjamin Helm, who is a general in this attack, is a kinsman of Mary Todd Lincoln, will perish in this attack. Again, when news arrives at the Executive Mansion in Washington, it will plunge Mrs. Lincoln into despair, having lost yet another person that's very close to her, in this case, Benjamin Helm, a Confederate general. Those attacks do not succeed in driving off the Union left. Negley, Reynolds, a number of these Union officers valiantly keep their troops from panicking, and from fairly strong positions in Kelly's Field, they are able to repulse repeated Confederate attacks. During one of these Confederate engagements, Jim Deschler, young Alabama general, the veteran of West Point, from the Utah and Mormon expeditions, will die, having his heart ripped from his body by a cannon shell, probably a solid shot, or perhaps a parrot shell, fired by one of the batteries in Kelly's Field. Deschler had been crawling on all fours to make sure his men had enough ammunition to check their status when the cannon shot hits him squarely in the chest. He will die. His body will later be taken home to Tuscumbia, Alabama, for burial. Well, in the middle of all this, because the Union troops have been continuously moving to the northeast through a mix-up in orders, some of the Union troops, thinking that's still what they're supposed to do, abandon their positions and go march north. Unfortunately, they're marching behind other troops that are stationary, and nobody's filling in for them. And that leaves a wide gap in Rosecrans' lines, through which the ever aggressive James Longstreet just pours troops into that gap. And you can see on this map, John Bell Hood is part of that attack. Hyman's part of that attack. Bushrod Johnson's involved. Stuart's men will later pick up the charge as well, with Frank Cheatham coming in reserve. At this point, the entire safety of the Army of the Cumberland is in deep, dire jeopardy because the Confederates have the ability to split this in two. Enter Phil Sheridan. Sheridan will bring his troops into play, a division commander. I think I may have said earlier, brigade commander. But Sheridan will deploy his men. They will counterattack. They will start pushing back and stymieing the Confederate attacks on the southern part of the line. But in the dead center, Bushrod Johnson's men and John Bell Hood's men sense an opportunity to really smash through the Union lines. Hood's men will advance through North Dyer Field. As you see this photograph on the field here on the right, and the depiction on the map, Hal Jesperson's map, one of many that he so ably drew for Joe's and my book, Unceasing Fury, Texans at Chickamauga. You can see the field over which the Texans are going to attack. Joseph Kershaw will be behind them. Henry Benning will be to the right. Again, these are veterans of Gettysburg, men that had just arrived via rail from Atlanta after their long journey from Richmond. So most of them, again, are very tired. Now they've got to go gently uphill and through this field under a massive Union artillery fire, as well as small arms fire. Robert's men are going to go all the way to the tree line. You see in the picture on the right. They will briefly overrun 3 Union artillery guns. Other troops from the Florida Brigade, again, veterans from Gettysburg. Colonel David Lang had commanded them temporarily at Gettysburg, but their nominal commander, Edmund Pettus Perry, is now back on the field, having recovered from his Chancellorsville wound. And so he's commanding some of these Floridians as they start coming in. You've also got what had been Law's Brigade also on the field here as well. Law's men will continue to push towards the artillery piece as well. You've just got a lot of moving parts in this fight. McNair's men are on the field. Humphreys arrives. Again, this had been Barksdale's brigade during the fighting at Gettysburg. Barksdale, of course, went down to Gettysburg. Benjamin Grubb Humphreys now commands what had been Barksdale's brigade. These fights, like all other Confederate attacks, start petering out. Union counterattacks start pushing them back. At the same time as the fighting's going on at North Dyer Field, Breckinridge and William Walker, Pat Claiborne, Alexander Stewart, they're going to launch fresh attacks. This is Leonidas Polk's men, mostly from his, and some of D.H. Hill's men. They are going to push into Kelly's Field. After some very savage and hard fighting, they're finally going to start cracking the Union line. At the same time, you can see the new Union line that George Thomas is starting to arrange along Horseshoe Ridge as they're trying desperately to stop these veterans from Bushrod Johnson and John Bell Hood. While that's going on, John Bell Hood goes down. Now, Hood originally wasn't supposed to be at Chickamauga. He had suffered a grievous wound to his shoulder at Gettysburg. His arm was in a sling. He had come to the train station in Richmond to see his men off. They cheered him wildly, and he decides, I'm going to go with them. And he jumps on the last train out with some of his men and arrives at Ringgold Station in North Georgia. gets off on his horse and had galloped to rejoin his men. To the cheers, wild cheers of his men who had no clue that John Bell Hood was in Texas. They all thought he was still in Richmond. And yet here on his second day on the field, actually third day on the field, John Bell Hood goes down. He's going to have a severe wound to a leg. It's going to cost him the leg. And his grievously injured Hood will be taken and carried off the field, will actually be carried many miles to the rear to a southern mansion where he will recover following the amputation of his leg. Some of you may remember these maps of various Civil War battles from the Golden Book of the Civil War from American Heritage when we were kids, the 1960s. This is Chickamauga. William Rosecrans has rode off the field trying to organize the defenses of Chattanooga, realizing the day is lost at Chickamauga. His chief of staff, James Abram Garfield, the future president of the United States, and Thomas Crittenden will try to organize some of the defenses as well. They too will start heading back to Chickamauga. That will leave George Thomas as the only senior officer left on the field. Pap Thomas will organize and valiantly man the defenses on Snodgrass Hill and a number of other small hills nearby. His defense, spirited defense, a very, very capable defense against a whole series of Confederate wave assaults throughout the afternoon of September 20th, will earn him the undying sobriquet as the Rock of Chickamauga. And in fact, Thomas saves the Army of Cumberland through his actions on Snodgrass Hill. By now, it's nightfall on September 20th. Most of the troops have now moved on towards Chattanooga. Fighting Joe Wheeler's cavalry will fight some engagements against Union cavalry southwest of this battlefield at Glass's Mill. Nathan Bedford Forrest men will get re-engaged as well briefly. But this is in effect going to be the cessation of hostilities. Wheeler will pursue some of the Union again into McLemore's Cove and will actually engage Kentucky Union cavalry who are trying to make it to Chattanooga, and Wheeler will capture a number of them. The 8th Texas 10th or sorry 11th Texas Cavalry will capture a significant number of Kentuckians in that engagement. That brings a halt to the fighting at Chickamauga. As we know, Bragg will retreat, Rosecrans will retreat into Chattanooga. He will eventually lose his job to U.S. Grant. Grant will counterattack and raise the siege of Chattanooga and will then drive through what's left of Bragg's army on Missionary Ridge and other Tunnel Hill, places like that. It will hit him again at the Battle of Ringgold during the subsequent Confederate retreat. And with that, North Georgia is lost to the Confederate cause pretty much for the rest of the war. Rosecrans is going to lose his job. And as mentioned, Bragg will also lose his job, be replaced by Joseph Johnston, who will then lead the fighting into 1864. Chickamauga will turn out to be the second bloodiest battle of the entire Civil War, behind only Gettysburg. 16,000 Union soldiers will fall or be captured, 18,500 Confederates. So the two sides roughly even in numbers, slightly more Confederates on the field, slightly more Confederates are wounded or killed or captured. And this is a Confederate victory, but it's kind of a hollow victory because, again, they failed to retake Chattanooga. Longstreet, somewhat incensed by what has happened here, will be shipped to East Tennessee to go fight Burnside, never to return to the Army of Tennessee. Bragg, before he's sacked, will have a number of generals, particularly William J. Hardee and Leonidas Polk, Frank Cheatham, people like that will lodge protests against him. And eventually, as mentioned, he will lose his job. So Chickamauga, known to many as a soldier's battle because the lack of control from the senior leadership on both sides, Very disjointed battle, which both sides are feeding in troops. Horrible loss of life that strategically does not accomplish nearly as much as Presidents Davis and Lincoln had hoped. With that, I will turn it back over to you, Mike, and we can take any questions that people may have. Thanks.